Simon Fanshawe, welcome to the podcast.
Well, I'm absolutely delighted. Thank you for asking me.
You do a lot of diversity work, but you root your diversity work in the thought of people like John Stuart Mill and the spirit of the Enlightenment. How do you think most diversity work gets that wrong, and what is different about the kind of diversity work that you engage in?
So, two questions. Just to say, my approach really has always been, and the book I wrote recently is called "The Power of Difference." So, what our approach is that we start really from the fact that the human condition is that we can't understand each other, and the human ambition is that we want to try and do so. But we can only try and do so in the certain knowledge that we never will. In other words, I can't see the world from your point of view, and I can't experience it in the way you experience it, and so on. So we're in this situation where actually trying to do that, kind of going on that journey. Sorry, I hate to use the word journey, but going on that journey, that is the valuable thing, and it's why we talk about diversity inclusion, because it's about trying to understand people's different experience of life, and it's also about trying to understand what they then bring to joint enterprise. So how that fits into a context of a business or an organization, which is obviously where diversity and inclusion sits as a kind of professional thing, is that what organizations have really is a bunch of strangers brought together to achieve a common objective. So the only thing they really have in common is what they're trying to do, whether it's making pizzas or teaching a course at university or putting a man or woman on the moon. So that's what they've got in common. And my proposition to them is that it's through their differences, what they each differently bring to that task and its different components. That's why diversity matters. And one further thing that I would say is that there's a key difference when we think about this notion of diversity. We think about the deficits. In other words, you can look at data and you could look at where the imbalances are between different groups of people. But there's another element of this, which is the diversity dividend. And the diversity dividend is what I was talking about. That's what happens when you start to combine the difference. So what I bring to organizations really is something where diversity is absolutely a talent strategy, if you like, to achieve common objectives. And I think I can talk about why I think that, because I think it comes from actually my political activism and how you achieve change. Why has it gone wrong? I think because we've just done a report on this, and it's kind of a working title is, Beyond Flag Waving and Tick Boxing. Because I think what happened was that some years ago, executives, HR directors, boards thought, yeah, diversity, this is a good thing. We're not getting access to talent, whatever. There are injustices out there. We ought to be part of making sure that our companies don't replicate that. So let's do diversity. But what they then did was they then delegated it. They didn't attach it to the strategy. They didn't make it a driver of the strategy. They said, this thing, let's delegate it. And what happened was it kind of grew into a bit of a monster because they didn't tie it into the core of what they're doing. And I think ultimately what's happened is that lots of staff are now asking of organizations what they actually ought to be asking of the world.
So a few thoughts here, right? I mean, first of all, I broadly agree with that outlook, with that approach. That part of what I love about living in New York, part of what I like about my experiences living in different kinds of countries, part of what I enjoyed as a child and a teenager in getting to know various people was that quote unquote diversity, right? Was places, institutional settings. We have a chance to get to know people who are different from you, who perhaps come from different cultures, perhaps have different religious beliefs, perhaps have different philosophical outlooks. And in cooperating with them, whether as fellow students, whether as part of the same soccer team or part of the same university, you get to discover something about the other person and the world. I guess I wonder to what extent a self-conscious diversity program is necessary to achieve that in societies that are already quite diverse. So I know that, and I think one of the places where I've learned from your work, but I also wonder whether there's a tension within it, is that, the Enlightenment value par excellence is merit. It is a career open to the talents, and the idea that you should be considered on the basis of your potential contributions, rather than on the kind of group to which you belong. But despite saying that your outlook is rooted in the Enlightenment, you're quite skeptical of a concept of merit. So, to what extent do institutions have to go beyond saying you can't discriminate against each other, you can't treat each other horribly, to say, let's hold diversity seminars, let's hold these places where we're really sort of addressing our diversity in a way that seems to turn us in a way into representative of our boxes? And to what extent should companies go beyond just trying to hire the best talent, again, without discriminating against anybody on the basis of their identity, to say, no, we should go beyond merit, we should ignore merit in order to self-consciously become a more diverse team?
Yeah, I don't think I'm skeptical about the notion of merit. What I would say is that you need to think about what you mean by merit. In other words, what do you value and what people are able to bring into organizations? And typically what you have is that merit is largely based on a technical notion, on a professional skill notion. So typically people will be lawyers or engineers or whatever. They will bring that technical skill. But the truth of it is there's a kind of skill threshold when you're trying to fill a job or create a team. But then the question is, what else is that person bringing? And I'm not suggesting ever that people should be recruited because of who they are. I'm saying that actually it's not who they are that matters, it's what they bring through who they are. So it's the stories they bring, the experiences they bring. And what I would say, crucially, and where I depart, I think, a lot from the generic standard kind of approach to diversity, is I think everybody's got a voice in this. Everybody's got their difference to bring, because we're not just diverse because we belong to certain groups. That may bring certain experiences which we share, but actually, how much experience do we share? As a gay man, how much experience do I share with other gay men? Well, the truth of it is, when gay men get together, we talk about coming out. When you first meet somebody who's gay, that's one of the things you talk about, because it is a shared experience. But beyond that, how you then thrive and survive in the world is down to your individual talent and personality. So what I would say is that if we start to think of merit as being that combination of skill and then also the knowledge that you bring and the experience you bring through who you are and your personality, then what you start to do is you start to combine a number of things with other people. So I would never suggest, I think it's important to recognize that certain groups of people, the members of certain groups and certain members of those groups experience disadvantage, but it's not a uniform experience. It's not an all-day experience. I mean, I often say that the thing about prejudice about lesbians and gays is we might experience discrimination every day, but we don't any longer experience it all day. So you bring those stories. So I'm saying let's reevaluate merit, because what you have often in jobs is what people do is they have an assumption about the merit that's required for the job. They then recruit to that assumption, and that assumption is never challenged. And in effect, what it can do is cut out people who actually have got enormous amounts of talent they could bring to that job, but they're just not perceived as being suitable for it.
So there's many parts of this that I like. I think often people think the problem with our societies is that they're too merit-based. And I've had people like my doctoral advisor, Michael Sindel, on this podcast to debate this point. I think the problem in many societies is that people don't feel that merit is going to get them places, even in a country like Italy, where they have a sense that, having the cousin work in the company or certainly work in the government office is the necessary requirement for getting hired or getting ahead, rather than being smart and hardworking and so on. And even when there are genuine problems with the sort of meritocracy, I think it's often because we have too narrow a concept of what merit entails. I'm all in favor in the United States of laws passed in some state levels to ban people requiring bachelor's degrees for jobs where there's no obvious reason why they need to be required, because it's just become a way of excluding people who may be very good at a job, who simply have had different life paths, and often different life paths because they started with less advantage in life. So I agree with having to carefully examine sort of what merit entails. I'm a little bit skeptical about this idea that a lot of what merit entails requires this personal story to tell. And I'm skeptical of it for two reasons. The first is that one of the things I most hate about the admissions system in American universities is the requirement to write this kind of personal statement where you self-exoticize yourself in some way to say, I want to study medicine because this person I know was, dying of cancer. And so, therefore I now have this great conversion experience where suddenly I want to become a doctor. And it's sort of terribly fake. And in fact, I worry that the new Supreme Court ruling on affirmative action in the United States is going to lead to even greater emphasis on the personal statement, because that's the one context in which universities can continue to consider race. And I don't think it's very healthy to tell 17-year-olds across the country that the one way in which they can gain an advantage to go into college, and they will gain a significant advantage, is to tell us a story of woe about how much their identity has been a terrible, terrible obstacle to them. Now, the other reason is that when you look at companies, when you're running an advertising company, right, or when you're in the artistic team of a television station, or in certain kinds of jobs, I can see how just having a diversity of walks of life is in itself relevant to the task, right? If you want to effectively advertise to a population that's diverse, it helps to have people who have roots in different kind of parts of that population to have a sense of how the ad is going to play in different milieus of the country. Now, by the way, if all of those people are graduates of Cambridge and Oxford University in England, or of Harvard and Yale in the United States, then even if they're ethnically diverse, they may not capture that diversity, right? But having a genuine diversity rightly understood for those jobs seems relevant. There's many jobs where I'm just not sure that's relevant, right?
If you're absolutely right. I'm not saying that I'm saying it's a way of thinking about people's talent, and it's a way of giving some value to the stories that they bring. And I think the key word which you said was exoticize. I mean, what you're finding here is that it's people desperately trying to find some way of participating in the oppression Olympics in order to give themselves what apparently is social value now from continuing to say. I mean, I find it infuriating that gay men. We had an MP recently. He's been 4 or 5 times re-elected. He went through a scandal because there was a picture of him and scantily clad on social media. He's written a book about the House of Commons. He stood up in the House of Commons and said, when one of the Conservative members talked about the importance of biological sex, he stood up and he said, "Your words make me feel unsafe." I mean, what kind of message is that giving to young gay people that still we have legal equality in Britain? It's one of the safest places to be gay, and an MP is standing up saying, and a mother of the House of Commons, that their parliaments that they feel unsafe. I mean, this is ludicrous. So I agree with you. But the key thing here is that what that is that's about social value from a certain kind of discourse, which is about continuing to be, in some way, as I say, playing in the Olympic oppression stakes. Now, another story, let me tell you a story from some time back, but there was a wonderful man who was a great mentor to me called Christopher Brink, who was the Vice Chancellor and Principal of Stellenbosch University. He subsequently came to England and was Vice Chancellor of Newcastle University. Christopher is a South African, and he was the first non-Broederbond member, Vice Chancellor and Principal of Stellenbosch. Stellenbosch University was the crucible of apartheid. And they taught mainly in Afrikaans. I mean, all the big figures from apartheid went there, and it was where the ideology was fashioned. So Christopher had a huge job because the ANC had come in, and he said, "No, universities are independent. I'm not going to transform the university because there's a new government telling me to. I've got institutional autonomy. We're going to do it because there's an educational reason to do it." And he adduced a number of things, and he wrote a beautiful speech about this in which he talked about the things that we do not know. But one of the things he did was he ran this thing called the Vice Chancellor's Award. And in order to apply for the Vice Chancellor's Award, you simply had to tell your story in front of the whole, eventually, when you won the award, in front of the whole university. And Chris talks about merit in context. Very simply, it meant that if you came from one of the townships and you had worked your way through that process and you'd got to the stage where you could valuably contribute to a university, then actually that was as valuable as saying, the kid down the road who's had all the advantages of being in a white kind of upper middle class or middle class school in South Africa, etc. So you know that story. It was a beautiful, beautiful way of demonstrating, I think, that merit comes in lots of different ways. So I agree with you. The attempt to fashion some kind of specialness when actually you kind of, we've all got specialness, but the idea of tying that to some demographic prejudice or oppression or whatever seems to me to be fake. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is the recognition that data will tell us that certain groups of people have disadvantage. But crucially, we have to understand in businesses, does that matter? Does it matter that certain groups are imbalanced in certain professions? It might not. Secondly, what actually is the cause of it? And thirdly, what can you actually do about it? So what you're trying to do here is unleash real talent. You're trying to unleash merit rather than stifle it. So that's how I would go at it, I think. And I wouldn't say that, affirmative action, those kind of things, because a good ideas, because they're not useful tools, because essentially what you're doing is you are appointing people on the basis of some demographic characteristic. And I don't see how that helps anybody. That's why I try and use this phrase, it's not who you are, it's what you bring through who you are.
So you alluded a few times to the fact that you were, one of the key voices in the gay rights movement in the United Kingdom. What do you think made that movement, and I wonder you'll agree with this assessment, fantastically successful? I mean, despite the discrimination that obviously still does persist in society to some extent, the position of gays and lesbians in British society, and for that matter in American and German society, in many countries in Latin America, and many countries in East Asia at this point, has just fundamentally transformed over the course of either of our lifetimes. Why do you think that movement has proven so successful and without polarizing society too much? I'm sure it polarized society at various junctures. But where we stand today, even right-wing populists across North America and Western Europe, by and large, accept gay rights, and sometimes even try to say that they are the only people who are going to protect gay rights against, supposedly less tolerant immigrants and so on. So how is it that the movement won and did that without, at least at this stage, polarizing society around this issue?
Fundamentally, and I'll explain this in historical terms, but fundamentally it was successful because we did not ask people to take a view and express their view about homosexuality. So what we asked them to do was express a view about equality. So if you go back in Britain to 1957, there was a famous report commission called the Wolfenden Report. And it was so called because it was chaired by Sir John Wolfenden. And it was a report into homosexuality and prostitution, a kind of peculiar sort of clash of two different things. Wolfenden said something really interesting. He said, to be blunt, the question before us is whether or not the state has a role in anybody's morality or immorality. In other words, the whole question in front of them was not about the morality of prostitution or homosexuality. It was about the role of the state in relation to it. It opened up a discussion which 10 years later, in 1967, became the partial, at that stage, decriminalisation of homosexuality. But essentially, it stopped being illegal. Now, when you go through, so then what happened was, it was this flowering of, gay things, every gay hiking, I remember a lovely American friend of mine who one of those kind of wealthy East Coast families, and he was trying to tell his grandmother, how he's trying to kind of come out to his granny. This rather, you can imagine the sort of beautiful, elegant kind of woman sitting in this rather smart house, in Martha's Vineyard or wherever. Anyway, so he says to his grandmother, he says, she says, what are you doing this weekend? He said, I'm going yachting. He said, with a gay yachting group. There was a long pause, and she looked at him down her nose, and she said, can't they yacht with anybody else? And I've always loved that. But the thing is, actually it's quite fun, because if you think about it, they couldn't yacht with anybody else, because if they'd come out in the yacht, they'd been thrown overboard. My point being is that this network emerged, hiking and politics and drag and all these things started because we weren't illegal any longer. Then what happened? Two things happened. AIDS happened at the beginning of the 80s for us, and then at the end of the 80s, a particular piece of legislation, the details of which I won't bore you with, but it was a right-wing inspired bit of legislation designed to stop local authorities investing in kind of gay welfare groups and education and so on and so forth. And that was what stimulated our starting of this organisation called Stonewall, because we realised we had no power to lobby about law. What's crucial about all of that, and then leading right the way through to 2014 when there was gay marriage, was at no point did we base the campaign on saying to people, do you think lesbian and gay relationships are morally, theologically, in whatever way, okay? Because in 1989, when we started Stonewall, we were 80-20 down. We wouldn't have won. So what we did was we said, do you think it's right that a group of people should be discriminated against by society and the law as a group? And if you say that to Muslims, Jews, Catholics, Protestants, they know what you're talking about. So they go, yeah, no, we don't like you, but we don't think you should be discriminated against just because of who you are. That's not fair. So
right. We don't like these other religious groups either, but we don't think we should stone them. Yeah,
exactly. So, but that bigger, I always talk about the bigger principle. So I always say about Stonewall that for me, what it was about was trying to create a platform for lesbians and gays to play a part in a world in which everybody wanted to live. So that when we talked about parenting, we didn't demand that we had a right to be parents. What we said was we want to contribute to bringing up the next generation. That's one of the great things one generation does for the next. When it comes to the armed forces, we want to be part of the defense of the nation because that is citizenship. That's part of citizenship, So it was always, I'll tell you a story about that if you like. I'm an army brat, and my dad was a senior ranking army officer and everything. I grew up with these people. And I found myself in a television studio once with one of those generals, and in Britain, they bark at you. Bah, bah. And the whole time, it's like living with a kind of rather gruff dog. And anyway, the standard...
That's very unfair to dogs, Simon. I'm going to defend canine honor here.
I like dogs and generals. I grew up with both. So anyway, I'm in the studio with this guy, and he produced the classic defense, which was that, and they always in Britain, when they talk about gays, they call them homosexuals. It's this wonderful archaic way of saying homosexuals, which I love. And he said he produced what I call the shower defense. And he said, well, if you're not a homosexual and you're in the shower, because these people don't have any consonants. They've not used a consonant since about 1945, so there's a shower. And if you're in the shower, you see, with a homosexual, you'll feel very, very sort of nervous and anxious and rather afraid, perhaps. And I said to this guy, to be perfectly honest, I said, if what makes you fearful and anxious is the idea that some other guy thinks you've got a really cute butt, I'm not sure the army's the job for you. As the Taliban's coming over the hill. Do you know what I mean? I think you need to be a bit more resilient. But so we had a lot of fun doing it, but it was always about this bigger principle. And that's the point I would want to make about, I think the key thing about politics is that you need to build big alliances around big principles. You don't need to build small groups of people around ideological purity. And we never said to people, you have to like us, you have to admire us. We felt it. We wanted, of course, to be accepted by our families and by our loved ones. And we didn't want to be beaten up. I'm not saying we didn't want and feel all that. But the political approach was always on this notion of equality and participation as citizens. And that's something you can build a very big alliance around.
Let me share another story, and then I have a question about this. I believe the story to be accurate. It was told, I think, by Stephen Fry on British television, but I haven't gone through the records to ensure that it is accurate. I may be contributing to transmitting an urban myth here, but supposedly Winston Churchill, when he was Prime Minister for the second time in the early 50s, was awoken for his morning briefing one day, and his assistant said, well, I'm afraid, Prime Minister, there's been a little bit of a scandal in the Commons. And he said, oh, yes, well, what is it? He said, well, one of our backbenchers has been caught in flagranti with one of the Queen's guardsmen. And this is February or so, and Churchill said, last night? Yes, Prime Minister. Awfully cold last night, wasn't it? Yes, Prime Minister. One of the coldest February nights on record. And Churchill pondered this for a moment and said, makes one proud to be British.
Yes, that's right. Yes, many a cold night's been suffered with a guardsman in Hyde Park. You're absolutely right. Mind you, the bearskin would come in handy too on a cold night like that.
The question I have is, how to take that stance, which I think rightly you credit with having been successful. How much of an internal fight was that within the gay rights movement? To what extent where there are currents within the gay rights movement who want to say no, let's tell these people they're bigots. Let's get into the fight with them. I know that in the American context, in the fight for same-sex marriage, there was, and Andrew Sullivan and Jonathan Rauch talk about this a lot, and I've mentioned this on the podcast a few times. A contingent of people said, we don't want to get married, right? That's a terrible hetero bourgeois mainstream institution, right? Like, we want to revolutionize society. And sort of the first step was in part winning the internal debate in order to then be able to make the most persuasive argument to the society as a whole. I mean, how sort of did that internal politics work, and what do you need to do in order to align the organization and the movement broadly on what you believe to be the winning strategy?
Well, that's absolutely right. I mean, there was an organisation called Outrage, and there was Stonewall, and we were definitely seen as a sort of ghastly sort of suck-ups, awful sort of suited creeps, wandering out the House of Commons, begging for equality. My view of it is very simple: is that I think that there's a in the marketplace of activism, there is absolutely the role for protest. Because those dramatic things, I mean, there was a famous case where some lesbians abseiled into the House of Commons, and that is a dramatic way of bringing to your people's attention an issue. So I don't have any problem with that. I think it's a bit stupid to glue yourself to the road, and I think it's a bit stupid to deface works of art. But there are creative ways in which you do that, and I think that's wonderful. And there's also a kind of celebratory element to it where, the left definitely thought that gays, I mean, the barricades would go up, and what we'd be handing out the canapes, we'd be thinking, well, this is a party, it'll be fun. So we always had that reputation, I think, on the left of being silly from the straight left, and then on the gay left, the Stonewall lot was seen as sort of besooted kind of suck-ups. So, but I think there's an interaction between those two forms of politics, and I think that they do actually. They're necessary if you use protest in that dramatic way to draw attention to things. So I've no problem with that at all. And in fact, it was a kind of dialogue and a bit of a hostile dialogue. But I would make this point: in Britain, when it came to arguing for equal marriage, to start with, it was absolutely clear that we wouldn't win marriage. We have a system here where the House of Lords has bishops and others in it. So we absolutely knew that we could not get gay marriage legislation through the two chambers. And it was not a manifesto commitment, which is the only way in which the House of Commons can absolutely override the House of Lords and so on and so forth. So the clever people, and I wasn't one of them, but I was obviously supportive of this, invented the notion of civil partnerships. Why did they do it? They did it because the purpose of this was not to get gay marriage. The purpose was to deliver a legal relationship which would enable you to be the next of kin to your partner when they were in a hospital bed, to enable you to inherit the house, etc., etc., etc. So we needed legal recognition of the relationship. So when we won civil partnership, there was
and that just as a side note, I mean, I obviously am a supporter of gay marriage, and I'm very glad that at this point we've moved beyond civil partnerships. But I suppose the ingenious thing strategically about civil partnerships at the time was both that it really anchored the debate about the areas where even people who may still have had negative views about gay or lesbian relationships would have the maximum amount of empathy. Of course, if you're in the hospital, you would want your partner to be able to come and see you. Of course, if you've lived in this house together for 25 years, it would be unfair if suddenly you're kicked out of it because there's no recognition of it.
Absolutely.
And it delayed or deferred the consideration of the places, the areas of a debate where the sort of religious objections and the moral objections would be most intense, right? Because it's one thing for somebody who has some skepticism about gay or lesbian relationships to say, yes, I suppose we should be able to see each other in the hospital. It's another to say, the sacrament of marriage has now been changed in ways that, from the point of view of my religion, is somehow troubling me. Yeah.
Well, there are two things here. One is so there's the sort of the religious, or if you like, we could characterize as the right wing objection. The left wing objection. What annoyed me about that was, what was the point? What were we trying to achieve? What we were trying to achieve was people being visited in hospital. We're trying to achieve people not being thrown out of the house they lived in for 20 years. All those things you've listed. So it didn't matter whether it was civil partnerships, whether it was marriage. It didn't matter. marriage would just become a sort of mad kind of totem somewhere up there that, you're supposed, but why? Because actually what you want to deliver is the material benefits which actually would change the lives of lesbians and gays. That's why strategically, it was a woman called Angela Mason basically who did it, who was the CEO of Stonewall. And that was brilliant. And also what happened, it socialized people to the idea of gay marriage. What happened was, and I remember saying this at the time, people will call them weddings. And they did. They didn't say, "Oh, I'm going to say civil partnership." It was a bit at the beginning, but actually they called them weddings. So you definitely had that tension, and you saw it with in there was one of the American elections when Pete Buttigieg was one of the potential candidates. In what do you call it in the pre thing when you select a candidate? He was one of them.
The bliss of not having to know in great detail the wretched system of American primaries. Yes.
The primaries, that's the one. That's what I'm trying to get to. So in the primaries, and people wrote these extraordinary things basically telling him he wasn't gay enough, because he had a husband and a child. He was kind of picket fence gay. And you think, well, hang on a second. There is the whole point of these struggles is that we don't have to be a one kind of gay. We don't have to conform to the stereotypes, whatever. So that's on the left. And then on the right, as you say, was this argument about marriage. And I think both of these things tell us something about activism now, because when we said we want to be married eventually, and I mean, I couldn't be bothered with the campaign about marriage until the then Pope said we couldn't have it. And I thought, damn you, if you say we can't have it, I want it now. I'm sort of teenage about that. I just sort of got rebellious. But the point about the right was, marriage, it's an institution between a man and a woman, and, it'll destroy marriage. Well, it clearly didn't destroy marriage. And there's a wonderful moment. I have a friend who is a South African who was on the Constitutional Court in South Africa. And in fact, he drafted the opinion on gay marriage and equal marriage in the Constitutional Court. He's called Albie Sachs. He's a remarkable guy and a great hero of the movement. And I went one day to see him, and it coincidentally was one of the days of the hearings on the gay marriage. So the 11 justices are up on the bench. And that day, one of the ex parte in the arguments against gay marriage was the Catholic Church. So there was a London barrister in his wig, sweltering heat, in the gown, and he's arguing about marriage. Now, you may not know, but in the South African Constitution, one of the things that is guaranteed are tribal and language rights. So, in other words, there are a whole set of different customs across the tribes and languages of South Africa, which are guaranteed in some sort of way, including, of course, would be in certain societies in South Africa, polygamy. So there was a marvelous moment when this Catholic stood up and he was saying, and theologically and morally and constitutionally, a marriage is between a man and a woman. And the then Chief Justice put his hand on his microphone and said very quietly into the microphone, "One woman." And the court erupted. And it was part of the judgment. So the peculiar thing about the judgment on the constitutional acceptability or whatever of gay marriage in South Africa is precisely based on polygamy and the notion actually of an African marriage. The point of the story is that gays getting married doesn't change marriage, it reinforces marriage. The demands, I think, that are being made by that, the sort of, marriage is heteronormative, we must tear it all down, that is a different kind of demand. It's of a different nature. And I think you begin to see it in some of the battles around sex and gender, where actually there is a demand that people change their lives in tune with what I want you to do. And we never did that. In the gay rights movement, and it's one of the reasons why it was so successful, which is your original question, we never really asked people to change very much. We asked them to accommodate us in some kind of way as equals, not accommodate us in a kind of inferior way, or you can have your own little separate whatnot, but as equals. And that's why it was so successful.
But there's a weird turn against the idea of tolerance, where a number of political theorists and a number of op-ed writers and people on social media eventually started to argue that tolerance is somehow second best and imperfect. And I see the point of that, right? I mean, ideally, we want a society where I'm not, walking past the, Ethiopian restaurant down the street from me and sort of gritting my teeth and say, oh my God, I have to bear this Ethiopian restaurant being here. Ideally, I think this is quite delicious food, and it's delightful that this restaurant is here, right? But I think in a really diverse society, we may be asking too much to want everybody to be rejoicing in every form of diversity all of the time. The precondition for people being able to lead worthwhile and free lives is simply that they not be actively discriminated against, that they be allowed to go about the business. And then, of course, as in this example, often the second step is that what you start to grudgingly tolerate, over time you get to know and to normalize, and over time you start to actually like and engage with. And if you don't, then probably your children will. So I think this sort of requirement to demand of people sort of full acceptance and affirmation from stage one is just normatively wrong, because that starts to trespass the liberty of freedom, the liberty of conscience, and the liberty of thought that others should have, the freedom of speech that others have. It's also often a strategic mistake, because if you ask too much at stage one, you may never get to the stage 2 and 3 and 4 you would otherwise get in a more natural way.
Well, you have to ask yourself, what is it that changes us? How do we change each other's opinions so we find ways of getting along with each other? And the thing about ethics is that ethics, society, these are processes, they're discussions, they're not statements. You don't make an ethical statement. You might end up with a statement, but the only way you can get there is by working out how you navigate the disagreements you have. And if you think in a relationship, I don't know how people who have those kind of politics that demand total acceptance, I don't know how with their partner they ever agree what movie to go and see. I don't know how you do it. I don't know how you run a relationship on the basis of demanding total agreement. So I take that outwards, and when I'm at work, working with people in an organization, well, that's the whole point. The key thing, and it's why it's such a great environment when it works well. What you do is you learn how to get along with other people, enjoy what they bring that's different from what you bring, and together create something. But at no point do you necessarily say to someone, well, what's your view about abortion and a woman's right to choose? Or, what's your view about, I don't know, any of the big moral issues? You don't need that. I've worked with people who are religious, and often I haven't bothered to ask. We just, we've found a way of working. I don't know what they think about homosexuality. I don't really care, to be honest. I care about how we treat each other. I do mind about that. And I at work, I always say this thing. I say, look, you can't demand that people respect each other at work. Number one, respect is earned. It's not demanded. But what you can ask people to do is treat each other respectfully. Because respect means everything. And so tolerance, what I love about tolerance is, and maybe it's because I'm older now, I've come to enjoy it in a way that when I was young, I died, I want to be tolerated. But actually, think of a sword, think of metal. When metal is its most tolerant, it's at its most flexible. Actually, it's also at its strongest. You can't fight a sword fight with a brittle sword. You can only fight it with a sword that's got real tolerance in the metal. So I've come to the view, I think, that it's not just strategically. It is also because of what I said right at the beginning. If we really can't understand each other, then we have to try. And unless that's accompanied with curiosity and some degree of humility and questioning, then actually we never will. And so I don't understand how we then create whatever we need to create together. I don't see how it happens if all you do is demand total agreement.
So we've talked a little bit about the success of the gay rights movement. Many of the institutions that were central in the gay rights movement have now drifted towards mostly advocating for trans rights. And I think this is partially a story of institutional drift that is very familiar from very different contexts, which is to say that when you have a huge nonprofit that raises a ton of money, like the Human Rights Campaign in the United States, and it does that in order to fight for a cause like gay marriage, once you win that cause, you could start to give back some of that donor money and, tell some of your staff that they'll unfortunately have to go and find other worthwhile things to do and reduce your size. Or you need to find a different cause that justifies all of that donor money. And sort of somewhat understandably, what organizations usually end up doing is the latter option. Now, in a way, I think the fight for trans rights, and this is sometimes forgotten in this debate, has been a great success. Which is to say that, I went to a high school in which actually nobody was really out as gay or lesbian until they were 18. But by and large, the people I went to school with were not particularly homophobic. There's a reason why people weren't coming out. I'm not saying that it was a super tolerant atmosphere. I think it probably wasn't. But if you went on a homophobic rant, people would look at you a little bit askew. Transphobia, I think, was much more rampant. Until something like 20 years ago, the idea that there was something just deeply odd and perhaps pathological about trans people was quite widely accepted, even in pretty progressive and liberal circles. And I think that has genuinely changed. The visibility and the acceptance of trans people in society went up very significantly between, let's say, the year 2000 and something like 2015 or 2018. Now, at the same time, it seems to me that particularly aspects of that organized trans movement, and I want to distinguish here between the spokespeople of the trans movement and the majority of trans people, have ended up making certain maximalist demands that do seem to go beyond accept and tolerate us to, you have to change how you behave. And it now feels as though that's actually leading to a backlash that is putting in danger some of the progress and achievements that the movement has made in the first part of the 21st century. So how do you see the difference between the strategy that you followed when you founded Stonewall and the institutional position taken by many organizations fighting for trans rights at the moment?
Certainly, when we started Stonewall, and look, there were six of us at the start, and then there was a whole bunch of people who gathered around that. We always had equal men and women, and I played the. I mean, Ian McKellen, the actor, was one of the six, and he gave an interview recently, and he said Simon was very helpful. He said he was always an irritant. He always got the outside perspective. So I must be very clear and put my role into the correct, relatively small proportion, which it justifies. But I would say that the big difference was that we were deliberately trying to change laws in a way that was encompassing. Whereas I think one of the problems now is, and at the heart of it is this notion of complete affirmation. There is also a material difference between being gay and heterosexual on the one hand, and then being trans and not being trans. I mean, these are very different things. They have very different implications. And the implication, what the business cliche people say when the rubber hits the road, Yascha, is when obviously somebody who's male in biological sex terms wants access to female spaces. And that is clearly the tension point. I would also say that when we talk about trans people, if you look at all the polling, certainly in Britain, if you say to people in Britain, the question that we posed to Stonewall, do you think that trans people ought to have access to healthcare, be treated without discrimination, be able to get on and lead their lives in privacy or in peace? People say yes, because basically people are a bit fair and think, of course, why would I want anybody to have a horrible time? I don't want anybody to have a horrible time. But the moment that you say, do you think that people who are biologically male should be able to access sports spaces and services? And then there are specific ones, changing rooms and so on and so forth. That's when there's a need for a conversation. Because what happens in the polling is that support for that plummets. So the political strategy has been successful insofar as it has forced a group of people by characterizing itself as we are the most oppressed group in the world, etc., etc. Somehow that notion has been then picked up by middle class liberals. And we middle class liberals love nothing more than associating ourselves with, the poor and the dispossessed. We love that. We adopt poor children, we give money to charity, we empathize with the oppressed, until we're blue in our parquet floors. We absolutely love it. So actually there was a really, people adopted the trans movement as if it was something that really signaled, just how kind of much they cared. The truth of it is that if you widen the definition of trans beyond people who are experiencing dysphoria and need therapy, support, possibly medical intervention. Once you widen it beyond that, you get into very contested territory. And actually, I would say that movement would have had a great deal more success with the general public had they then said, well, we acknowledge that there are issues here. We've got to actually confront this and deal with it. The minute you refuse to acknowledge the issues, you are in an impasse, and people go, well, I'm sorry. And then they say, my teenage daughter, my wife, my son, me, the woman, whatever. So I think there's a strategic failure, but it's also a refusal to acknowledge that actually you can have a perfectly different view about gender and sex and still manage to work together, manage to live in the same street or whatever. So we're back to tolerance. People are not prepared to go through that process of tolerance and understanding.
Andrew Sullivan has recently called for what he calls a Gay and Lesbian Liberation Day. He acknowledges that there are important causes in the fight for trans rights, but he says that they're separate from the fight for gay and lesbian rights because in certain contexts they clash against each other. And so he thinks that there need to be devoted organizations that aren't sort of under the LGBTQ umbrella, but rather specifically fight for the interests of gays and lesbians within that umbrella. Do you agree with that?
Well, yeah, I got asked to fill in some data protection form the other day, and I was asked what my sexual orientation was, and it said that was I a straight, bi, or LGBTQIA2S plus. And as I said to a friend, I said that they seem to have turned one of my great passions in life, which is lesbian and gay equality, into a slightly secure password on the internet. And I just thought, what?
There's a problem for the audience in this conversation that I mute myself when a guest is speaking because that helps with sound quality recording, making sure there's no interference and if there's some background noise on my end, it doesn't show up on theirs. But I have to always struggle to unmute myself to acknowledge Simon's jokes here, which are excellent. Sorry, go ahead.
Kind of, if the audience were always happy to unmute themselves, I've always said too with the mute button when it started during COVID, for 60 years, to be honest, people have wanted a mute button on me, but they finally got the button that they wanted. But look, if you go through let's just stick to LGBTQ. LGBT sexual orientation, T gender identity, Q. I'm not sure. Q is a word I hate. I think it's a slur. It was what was shouted at me. I won't use it. Don't like it. Feel very offended by it. Nonetheless, other people don't. They feel that they want to adopt it. It's a new kind of political identity, if you like, and it's a more
right. And that's what's strange about it. However useful or unuseful it is as a term, the oddness of it is that in a collection of terms that seem to demark various forms of sexual orientation, the word queer seems to be a political identification, right? What makes you queer is a particular kind of set of view about politics. And that may be useful in certain contexts, but sort of strange as part of that particular list. So that's one of my concerns about that term in that context. The other concern is that as a result, you have the rather remarkable finding by Pew, I think, a couple of years ago, which may have, obviously there's bisexuals with whom that may be true and so on, but I think it does indicate something slightly strange, that currently in the United States, a majority of people who consider themselves LGBT and specifically Q are currently in heterosexual relationships.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I find it quite extraordinary, really. And it's kind of, I mean, a bit of me just says, look, get your tank off my lawn. I mean, it's like, what are you doing? I mean, again, I think it's an attempt to appear special, to appear somehow. I don't know. I don't understand it. The only good explanation I've ever heard of it was I once asked a woman, I once had an intelligent conversation on Twitter. That's a sentence you don't hear every day. And she was great. And she kept on, and she continued to use the word queer. And I said to her, I really would like to understand what you mean by that. And she gave an example, which was this. She and her partner, explicitly not wife, and two gay men had between them, each of the men had fathered a child with each of the women. So there were four adults and two children. And and her view was, the thing you did in Stonewall was that you campaigned for this kind of heteronormative marriage. My queer identity wants to be recognized that as a family. And I want I want a new way of thinking about the family and so on and so on. And it was the first time when I thought, oh, well, that's great. I get that. That is a radical and revolutionary view. And she wants to revolutionize the relationships and so on and so forth, and perhaps put a legal structure around it or whatever. Great. I don't see how it would work. I'm not sure I agree with it. But that's not my point. My point is that it really explains something that said, well, all right, if that's radical, we used to call it radical drag or, whatever, or gender fucking and so on and so forth. All those things are fine. The problem with it is, though, that when you lump these letters together, the group doesn't have any coherence. I'm not sure who or what it's describing or who or what it's demanding. Because, as I say, what people who are intending to or going through the process of transition want is wholly different from what I want or need as a gay man or a lesbian wants and needs in society. So these are totally different things. But worse than that, what's happening now, I think, is that, I'm definitely now the wrong kind of gay. I mean, gay has turned into this peculiar sort of ideological notion now. And I thought the whole point of fighting these fights was so that we didn't have to be gay any longer. The whole point. I remember my mother once, bless her, me turning up with the placards and the dungarees and the aubergine hair and the earring, and one of those placards saying "F you, I'm gay" or whatever it was, And my mother said to me, she said, "Darling, why do you have to make so much noise about it?" And I and I said, well, so one day we don't have to. And I just said it off the top of my head. But I really mean that. I really mean it. I don't want to. Whereas it feels to me like what's happening now is that identity rather than material reality of people's lives is becoming more important than anything else. And what that means is that in the end, you get to this notion of a subjectively defined identity, which is not about the material disadvantage you experience then. It then becomes a whole set of identities which are neither provable nor unprovable. So when you look at self-ID and you try and put it into law, it becomes an unhelpful and entirely unworkable concept. And the only way it works, self-ID only works if you affirm my identity. Well, my feeling is that I've got to come to terms with my own identity. I don't need society to affirm it. What I need is society not to deprive me of legal rights on the basis of it. But I don't need to affirm other people's rights, beliefs, or whatever. I need to get along with them and tolerate them and work with them.
One of the basic points of structuralist linguistics is that the meaning of a word isn't simply defined by correspondence between this word and an object in the world. It is in part defined by other words in the language and the way in which this specific word is different from those words. So it is as much defined by what it doesn't mean as by what it does mean. I never was quite convinced by that, but I think there's something interesting about that. And I wonder whether sort of what the category of LGBTQ does is not so much pick up a commonality in the experience or the life reality of a huge swath of very different people who are LGBTQ, who at this point, according to self-polling among young people in the United States, are 30% of the age cohort. So a very large and diverse group that goes from people who are clearly gay or lesbian or trans, which is a different kind of thing that defines a lot of their lives, to people who may have had one or two sexual pieces of experimentation with somebody of the same sex, and now say I'm queer, right? But I think really one of the functions of a term is to demark the person who is not LGBTQ, right? So it is sort of as much about saying, here are the people who aren't LGBTQ, and perhaps in certain kinds of contexts it might be suspect, as it is about giving voice to a common set of experiences that within the category of gay men, within the category of lesbians, within the category of trans people, seems to have some significant reality. But once you are approaching what you call the moderately secure internet password, there just doesn't seem to be enough commonality left within that group for that term to be as meaningful in terms of what it picks out
also,
as in what it leaves out.
Yeah, and also it's curious, isn't it, that it's that LGBTQ two-spirit plus, that is also defining itself and excluding certain gays and lesbians. So there are a whole bunch of gays and lesbians who are told that unless they say, I mean, an example from work where somebody in a client business that we work with, she was not allowed into the LGBTQ plus group because she would not say that she identified as a lesbian. She said, I am a lesbian. I'm not identifying, but I am. It's my material reality. It's what my life is. So I find it odd that I
That's fascinating. So she said, "Look, I mean, I'm a woman. I'm in a relationship with women, or I have, sexual relations with women. But because I don't want that to be sort of a label I put on myself, they literally wouldn't let her join this group in the workplace."
She would not accept. She did not want to accept that being a lesbian was a subjective state of mind. She said, that is my material reality. And what you're seeing in the UK now, it started in the civil service. And one of the reasons it started in the civil service is that there is a very extensive process through which you have to go in order to set up a staff network in the civil service. And what this group of people did was there was a group of lesbians and gays who were, in their own terms, I think they would say they were sex realists. In other words, they were people who believed in the importance of biological sex. They didn't deny that gender also had a significance, but they do say that sex has an importance, and that same-sex relationships are same-sex, not same-gender relationships, and so on. And they were explicitly excluded from the LGBTQ network in the civil service. So they decided to set up their own network, and they went through the process, and you'll now find in Britain they're called SEAN, Sex Equality and Equity Networks. And you've now got them in the police, you've got them in HR, you've got them in the civil service, you've got them in journalism. They're springing up all over now because they're full of people who will not, do not conform to this new form of being gay. And you find it on Pride. I mean, this is Pride Month. I mean, goodness knows. I mean, I'm sorry to sound like an old fart, but really, do we Pride Month? I mean, we were campaigning for lesbians and gays to being lesbian and gay to be equal, not to be compulsory. We don't want people to have to suffer for a month to sort of, hymn us and think how fabulous we are. But actually, people who are lesbian and gay, thousands of lesbians and gays now feel excluded from Pride because it's become this ideological LGBTQ plus movement rather than something that had a material basis in political rights or whatever. Now, okay, things move on, I accept that, but I do find it odd, and it was what we said to Stonewall, a group of us, in 2014, and then, well, later actually, 2015-16, when it had started. We said, if you carry on campaigning in this way, you will divide the movement. And sadly, I mean, very sadly, and it is huge regret to me, that's what's happened. And there's massive hostility now between two sides of that group of people.
So fill people who may not know the British context as well in a little bit on the evolution of Stonewall and what happened to his organization that you founded. It really is. I mean, I remember from my time living in the United Kingdom that it was the most visible and well-known organization fighting for the rights of gays and lesbians. How has the organization evolved over the last 10 years, particularly on this trans issue, and what do you think that means for that fight?
Well, it got up to 2014-15, which was when gay marriage became the reality. What it had done was campaigned in the way that I've described on these really quite basic issues. So they were originally the age of consent, and that used a mechanism at the European Court. In other words, there was a lever that we could use on the British government to look at legislation. We kept on losing the vote on the age of consent in the House of Commons, but I had this rather kind of Ho Chi Minh kind of phrase that I used to use. I say every defeat is a victory in the court of public opinion. You know, we built support even though we kept on losing the vote, and we built support on this notion of equal rights, equality, equal treatment, and that then extended to immigration rights, extended participation in the armed forces, to adoption and fostering, and so on and so forth. And there was a marvelous moment I remember when the regulations were changed so that if you were a lesbian and you and your partner had a baby, you could both be on the birth certificate as the parents, and that was a major moment. And there was a wonderful woman who had worked in the City of London, and she stood up and this was just round about the crash, and she stood up and said that she never thought, because at that point, you know, the city had no, you know, was seen by everybody as kind of ghastly and evil and whatever. And she stood up, she said, I never thought I'd reach a point in my life, she said, where being a banker would be less popular than being a lesbian. So we really, you know, we got there. It was a fantastic moment of all those various things. 2014, gay marriage, the chief executive of Stonewall left, so they had an option. What do we do now? Big tick, we've achieved our political objectives. My view was, and a lot of other people's view was, now our job is to go local and build those alliances locally, which we built successfully nationally, so that with employers or schools or whatever, we had that dialogue at a local level. So when we're talking about sex and relationship education, or when we're talking about discrimination within businesses or whatever, we actually had the alliances to try and deal with that. They didn't do that, as you said. What happened was they then adopted campaigning on trans rights. My view has always been, and I think I may differ from Andrew Sullivan and others on this. I think Stonewall can campaign on what it wants to campaign on. That's not my argument with them. My argument with them has always been the way in which they campaign. Once they started acceptance without exception, which effectively said, unless you agree with us, you're a bigot, in its most extreme form. And in fact, one of its chief executives did say that lesbians saying that they were same-sex attracted was a form of sexual racism and equivalent to racism and anti-Semitism. I mean, that's an extraordinary position to be in, where the organisation that supposedly represents the interest of all lesbians and gays starts to turn against a section of lesbians and gays. So my argument has always been,
and to be clear about what that means, because I think it's a little bit cryptic, what that is saying is that if you're a lesbian woman who says that you're only interested in having sex with women who are biologically female, then you're a bigot.
That is the phrase that was a form of sexual racism. You're a bigot, you're prejudiced, you need to get over your prejudice. And there's been a number of expressions of these kind of things. I mean, similarly, a trans woman who runs the Rape Crisis Centre in Edinburgh was, I think the phrase was to reevaluate that if a woman who came to the centre didn't want to be counselled or in some way supported by a trans woman, they need to re-examine their trauma. They need to reevaluate their trauma and actually look at their own attitudes. So these are really serious questions. But my point is that the idea that the gay movement turns on certain gays for what they believe, we never did. When we were in Stonewall, look, we were agnostic. Tories, Liberals, Labour, all sorts of people. The only people we had a problem with the Socialist Workers' Party, because they used to turn up. You know, we'd be campaigning to get Tories, Conservatives to vote for us, and they'd turn up with campaign posters saying "Tory scum," and you go, no, they're not scum today. They're chums. Tory chums. Change the poster, but. You know, so that's the whole point. We put together big alliances. What's happened now is it's become ideological rather than representational. And I think that's a real shame. And you find that in lots of different things. I mean, I think, you know, black friends say the same about some, you know, race groups, staff race groups, where actually there's an ideological view of race which takes precedent over that much broader and perhaps different sense of what race, the significance of race in people's lives. So that's what happened. And it pivoted with a new chief exec who took it in this direction. And then it sort of just got worse, really. In other words, when people start to say this is not the right direction to go in, they went, well, you're bigots and we're not going to listen to you. And we're going to go. So they doubled down. and doubled down. And now what's happening, I think, which is sad, is that the schemes that were started, pre-2014, which were the employer schemes where would sign up, and that would basically show that you'd gone through thinking about how gay people in your business, had a good time and were okay and not discriminating against. That turned into pages and pages and pages of ideological tick box in which you were asked how many posters you've got up, what kind of language you're using about women and mothers, and all this kind of stuff. And of course, what's happening is that business after business after business is saying, actually, I'm not going to do this. And then they started the legal advice they started to offer people was faulty, and we've seen that in some of the tribunals that have come through. So it's kind of losing its credibility, which is a great shame.
I have a final question for you, Simon. You're clearly somebody who both has always approached this fight with in good spirit, and uses humor a lot in how you talk about things. What role do you think that upbeat, optimistic attitude, and particularly humor, play in an effective form of activism?
Well, oddly, and I didn't realize this was the case, but I am told by people that I was the first out gay stand-up comedian in Britain. I was a comic for 10 years. I didn't realize this. The reason I didn't realize this was when alternative comedy, as it was called, started. There were all sorts of new voices. That was the deal. We were trying to create a new kind of comedy, influenced part by America, but also by the political context in Britain. But the very famous satirist Peter Cook, the English satirist, of course, said that had the humour been better in the cabaret clubs of Berlin in the 1930s, it would have defeated the Nazis. Now, so you have to be a bit careful about what you think humour can do. What I think humour can do is humour can help to embrace. It can also divide. I mean, it's a whole other subject, and I do a kind of show with somebody called Professor Sophie Scott, who's a neuroscientist from UCL who studies laughter. So it can divide as much as it can unify. But what you can do, I think, is you can use humor in a way to help people break through and relax. And I absolutely, when I go into companies, and I'm faced, as I was the other day, with a construction company. I'm in a hotel room in Birmingham. There's 150 blokes, well, 140 blokes and 10 assorted. And I looked at them, and the first thing I said to them was, I said, blimey, I said, very diverse group. And they giggled a bit. I said, you know what? Just for the sake of ease, I think I'm going to address you collectively as Kevin. And that got a big laugh. And then I said, any Kevins in the room? And there were 5 Kevins in the room. I said, right, you're the leaders now. And I think if you can go in and what I do with the work that I do is I try and disarm people, because one of the things that absolutely puts people off is if you go in and wag your finger from a moral position of moral high, you think is moral high ground, and you start chastising them for not being the right kind of people. Frankly, you're not going to engage them, and we need to engage them. We need to engage them in doing diversity properly, so it really values what people bring differently, and doing politics properly. We need to go back to building big alliances. And it is one of the bizarre things about non-binary, those people who say they're non-binary. In political terms, they're often the most binary people you ever meet.
Simon, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Real pleasure. Thanks very much for asking me.